So a strategy that is going to increase value for the elites as opposed to democratizing access and making access cheaper and more affordable to everyone, I think is only going to exacerbate inequality, not just in the US and Canada, but everywhere.
Welcome to episode 403 of the Community Broadband Bits podcast from the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. This is Jess Delfiaco, Communications Manager. Today, Christopher talks with Steve Song, who is a part-time fellow with Mozilla. On the show today, Steve explains how he became interested in helping people get connected to high-quality internet access. And he talks about why some of the strategies the United States has adopted are not designed to bring internet access to the most people possible. Steve tells Christopher about the new ways spectrum is becoming available for innovative approaches to expanding wireless connectivity, and they discuss the ways in which our current pandemic crisis has influenced how we think about networks and how prepared we are to depend on them. Now here's Christopher talking with Steve Song of Mozilla.
Welcome to another episode of the Community Broadband Bits podcast. I'm Chris Mitchell with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, working out of my house in St. Paul, which is better than Minneapolis any day anyway. But today I want to talk with Steve Song, who is a person that I think of as being a very interesting thinker on wireless issues, and more broadly, someone who thinks outside the box, who isn't just the kind of person who feels constrained by what's been going on. But anyway, he's a part-time fellow with Mozilla. He's also works with the Network Startup Resource Center at the University of Oregon, and he does some work with the Association of Progressive Communications on something that's near and dear to my heart, supporting community networks around the nation. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Thanks very much for having me.
Steve, you and I met as part of the Mozilla contest in which we were judging. We're deciding who wins and loses for some funds around community networking technologies and disaster resiliency last year with the WINS contest.
That's right, yeah. It was a very interesting competition.
Yes, it was. And there was great projects, I think many of whom we all loved and had to make hard choices on. But I was very impressed with you throughout in terms of just experiences that you'd had and judgment that you could share that I didn't feel like other people had. And I'd sort of made a note that I wanted to have you on the show. And then recently we were on a call together after the shut-ins began, when people began staying home. And you just made a stray comment that I felt like we really should address, which had to do with where we've prioritized wireless technologies going in recent years. But let me just start. Let me ask you, tell us a little bit about yourself. What's the 90-second version of how you came to be interested in all of this work and supporting getting people connected around the world?
It goes back a long ways. It actually goes back to the early 90s. I moved to South Africa to get involved in the mass democratic movement there, and got involved in setting up one of the first internet servers for nonprofits there, and in running a nonprofit internet service provider, and was just amazed how, while the postal service was completely subverted by the apartheid government, email and internet actually provided this outlet for nonprofit organizations to reach the outside world and to self-organize. And it just seemed to me that this was something of unlimited potential in terms of benefits to civil society. Of course, the reality is proven that it's a sword that cuts both ways in terms. But we still agree that the benefits outweigh the downsides. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't be talking today.
Right. I mean, it's easy to see that. Let's just say that a loved one suddenly indulges in conspiracy theories that they hadn't before, or people who are in some ways maybe harmed by a hoax or phishing attacks on email or something like that. But we tend not to notice that every research, biology center in the entire world is working together right now on a cure or a vaccine or mitigation or other things, sharing information in ways that just are unfathomable 50 years ago.
Not to mention literally millions of students who are, carrying on their education or trying to carry on their education thanks to being able to connect to the internet. Although, part of what I hope we'll talk about today is all those students who can't do that.
Yes, yeah, I think 10 years ago, I think that a lot of our cable networks would have fallen under the onslaught. We had many fewer people connected. And let's hope that if this happens again in 10 years, that everyone will have a high quality home connection and will be able to deal with that misfortunate situation even better. But let me ask you about something, which is, as we think about whether we have prepared technologically well for this or not. Tell me a little bit about, when we were talking before, you mentioned that the hero of connectivity has been mobile technologies. And I'm just curious if you can tell us what that means.
Well, I think certainly in emerging markets, if you go back to the early 90s, telecommunication infrastructure was terrible. I mean, it was mostly copper-based and poorly maintained and not a lot of investment going into it. And with the arrival of GSM technologies and also other innovations like pay-as-you-go services, it allowed people to gain access to voice and messaging communication places we would never have dreamed that it was economically possible. So a whole revolution of connecting people to critical life-saving technology happened over the course of, say, 1994 to into the sort of 2000s, and that transformed with the arrival of smartphones into the delivery of internet via smartphone and tablet technologies into places that nobody would have believed possible as well. So it is a remarkable story, and one that one would hope would continue to deliver access. But I think what we're seeing now is just the limitations of that model, that mobile networks go so far into areas, but where in rural areas where there are sparser populations, where income levels are lower, there's just not the economic incentive for operators to deliver services.
One of the things that we've seen in the United States, and I'm presuming it's true if you have any low-income households in Canada. I'm not entirely sure you have any, because it's such a we idealize it as such a wonderful place where everyone's polite and I guess in some ways above average, which is not Minnesota anymore, unfortunately, with the end of of Garrison Keillor's reign. But the point I was getting at is that we have a lot of people who depend on mobile technologies here as well for the internet access, because they cannot afford a fixed connection in their home. And if they have to choose between a mobile connection and a fixed, many have chosen a mobile connection. And so, you described how the world's been connected, but in many ways, our working class people who are on the edge have also had to rely on mobile networks because we haven't made it a priority to make sure everyone can afford a high quality fixed connection, even though they're mostly available in the United States. Yeah,
I think that if we are going to connect everyone affordably to the internet and all the rest of it, we need actually a mix of models. And large operators have delivered tremendous value in terms of the spread of network infrastructure. But, just as with any business or any sector, small businesses are just as important as big businesses. And historically, that's been impossible to do in the telecommunications sector, because you had to invest in the entire supply chain of communication. But now, thanks to the spread of fiber optic networks, there's a certain disaggregation that goes on. And if you can connect to a fiber optic network, then you can arguably deliver competitive services anywhere. And that's what we see with a lot of wireless ISPs, particularly in the US, but everywhere else in the world as well, is that they can generate businesses and deliver services. And indeed, community networks can as well, in terms of operating different sustainability models of cooperatives and community-owned network infrastructure. To date, they've largely been limited to what we know as license-exempt spectrum or Wi-Fi in the 5 gigahertz and 2.4 gigahertz bands, which is great, but is somewhat limited in the ability to deliver services for two reasons. One, because it's a limited amount of spectrum, but also because license exempt works because the power limits are constrained on it, which means you can operate only fairly small networks with that, as opposed to the mobile network operators, which operate transmitters that are broadcasting much more loudly and can cover a bigger area.
One of the things you said when we got the idea for the show was that we have not prioritized 5G as providing any of the functionality that we really need right now as we live in our homes and poke our heads out on occasion to make sure no one's around before we run to the grocery store or take a jog. And so I'm curious what you meant by that. Have we, what else could we have done if Steve Song was the wizard who set the 5G specs, and what should have been done in terms of how we evolved to the next generation of wireless technologies here?
5G does represent, tremendous technological advances in many respects. But, if we were to wind the clock back to, the 1900 and think of the telecommunication industry a bit like the motor car industry, it's, we're at that moment where, you could have Henry Ford, deciding to build the cheapest, most practical car for as many people as possible. Or you could have Mercedes-Benz, deciding to build an elite automobile for the for the discerning customer who can afford it and requires very, very high performance vehicles. And 5G is more of a Mercedes-Benz than a Model T Ford, right? It's focused on very, very low latency connections, which may serve the interests of high frequency traders. Or focused on, like massive amounts of bandwidth to serve virtual reality applications. But it's not focused on driving down the cost of access, and it's not focused on rural connectivity. And I think if we've learned anything from the pandemic, it's that we need to make sure everybody's connected. Because right now, in order for this strategy of everyone, staying home, they need connections to the internet. They need their kids to be able to gain access to information. They need to be able to operate, remotely. Of course, that's not practical for everyone, but there are a lot of people who can still carry on their jobs if they had, access to connectivity. So a strategy that is going to increase value for the elites, which is, a focus on urban architecture and higher, faster bandwidth, as opposed to democratizing access and making access, cheaper and more affordable to everyone, I think is only going to exacerbate inequality in not just in the US and Canada, but everywhere. A strategy to do that would be to focus on driving down the cost of 4G infrastructure and making it pervasive, at the same time as you're developing 5G infrastructure. And there's lots of interesting things going on in that domain. So there's an initiative as part of the Telecom Infra project called Open RAN, which is opening standards for radio infrastructure. There's lots of low-cost or manufacturers there who are producing 4G technology at the same kind of prices as we think of as Wi-Fi infrastructure. But now the challenge is, how do we open up that ecosystem, give access to spectrum so that, those technologies and those more kind of federated open standards-based approaches can thrive. And the U.S. is really, full credit, on the forefront of that happening. So the FCC is doing that with the 3.5 gigahertz band with something called Citizens Broadband, or CBRS, which is fantastic, very much at odds with the rest of the world that has rather decided to auction that spectrum in a much more traditional manner. And recently, the FCC have also announced that the 6 gigahertz band of their intention to expand, 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi into 6 gigahertz. So in many ways, the U.S. regulator is very much someone to look to in terms of ideas for innovation in this space. But at the same time, you have this discussion, of kind of like, how do we win the 5G race in order to achieve economic supremacy? I think economic supremacy comes from everyone having affordable access, because the real generators of value are the people, right? Not technologies.
I agree absolutely with that. And I'm just struck by one of the things that one of the reasons that we fear, in some extent, the rise of China is because it has so many people who could be so incredibly productive and do so much, and similarly with India, is that the number of people they have that could do interesting things if they were all connected and that sort of a thing. We don't worry as much about the rise of Luxembourg. There's some limits there. But if let me be contrary and say that it seemed to me that you were saying we missed opportunities, but then you listed a lot of things we're doing right in terms of the CBRS, in terms of the 6 gigahertz for unlicensed Wi-Fi. To some extent, T-Mobile, with the way it's deploying its 5G in terms of the rural areas, will bring the benefits of 4G to a wider audience because of the spectrum bands that they're using. I'm not exactly sure what I'd change if I could go back and implement your plan. So what didn't we do that we should have done more specifically?
Yeah, I mean, I think my comments are directed more broadly than the U.S.
So let's just get this on record then. So we have, a person who, both of us are very critical of many things that this FCC has done, but it's a reminder that they have made some very good decisions that will give us long-term benefits, despite the fact that we would still disagree with perhaps a majority of the decisions they've made.
Yes. What I like about spectrum policy in the U.S. is that there have been very deliberate decisions taken to enable small enterprise to deliver services. And the US has a thriving wireless ISP industry that is benefiting from those decisions. Could they do better? Sure. But I think in those respects, the US is an outlier. If I look at the rest of the world, few countries have taken the steps to enable access, for instance, TV white space spectrum, which the US was a pioneer of. You get a few countries following suit, but it has, ultimately been slow to take off elsewhere.
I'm just fascinated by that. Is that because of incumbents generally? Are they just more powerful elsewhere? Is it actually corruption? Is it what? There's a tendency in North America, in particular in the United States, I think, to assume one reason that doesn't happen is people aren't as intelligent elsewhere, and that's not my experience. My experience is people elsewhere are quite intelligent, and so I'm curious why they're making decisions that we would think of as being pretty easy to classify as wrong.
There are a few reasons. One, it didn't transpire as successfully as one might have hoped in the US. So there was a lot of pushback from the broadcast industry, from the wireless mic industry, which resulted in the regulations being a kind of, a much more watered down set of regulations than one might have hoped, and somewhat bureaucratic in how it's applied, which has slowed down, I think, its adoption certainly in emerging markets, because it's now quite a complex thing to adopt with, geolocation, database authentication, and so on. I think it has also suffered from, a lot of lobbying from the mobile operators who see it as a potential threat to their business model, which relies on exclusive access to spectrum, which they pay for, typically at auction or through other mechanisms, millions of dollars for that exclusivity, which then acts as a kind of firewall to participation from other operators. And they see, things like dynamic spectrum as Wi-Fi as ultimately sort of threatening that model. And, fair enough, it should threaten that model.
That's the goal.
Any healthy ecosystem, if you think of a forest, you want, young growth that will ultimately grow up to be big trees. And the idea of sort of killing off or stopping that growth is not a great stimulus to competition.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that I recall us discussing is communications in times of disasters. And I'm curious about that as well. I mean, in terms of the points that you make, I think are very well taken, in that we haven't chosen maximize the democratic potential of these technologies by driving down the cost and making sure they're widely available. One of the areas in which I suspect will pay for that is in the response to disasters, of which I think you could certainly classify what we're in right now, where the systems are actually working better than they may in other disasters. But nonetheless, still we see lots of problems, and most especially because of how many people are not connected to high quality networks right now. And so do we build a more brittle system than we had to?
This disaster is unique. In that it's not something that we can recover from quickly, and it's something that actually requires us to stay in place. And we've never experienced that before, and there's no quick answer. I mean, I think there are some modestly rapid responses in, Google Loon are going to deploy over Kenya to increase access there. But, it's not like we can suddenly roll out 100 new base stations somewhere to fix the problem of affordable access for all. I've seen a lot of articles in the press, saying, well, actually, broadband is something that's so important to us. It needs to be a utility, and we need to go back to thinking of it like a utility. I largely agree with that perspective, although, I don't think anybody wants to go back to the days of kind of, a single monolithic, national bureaucratic utility. I think there's an opportunity now to revisit the ideas of utilities in the same way that, electric cooperatives have done so amazingly in the US and are now evolving into fiber optic utilities. That local ownership of infrastructure, especially in rural areas, just seems like a very natural response to the problem. Because it's, I live in rural Nova Scotia in Canada, and, we care about our little economy here and are prepared to invest in it. But the mechanisms are simply not designed to enable that or support that. All of the kind of universal service schemes are aimed at big operators and trying to, somehow create an attractive enough scenario for big operators to arrive here. And even when they do, you may only get one operator that actually ultimately ends up serving a region through a universal service program that provides you with access, but it doesn't necessarily provide you with affordability because there's no competitive pressure on the prices.
You allow me to make a wonderful point that I've been kicking around lately, which is in the United States, the Connect America Fund has certain requirements in terms of a history of operations, a letter of credit, and this and that. You got to jump through these hoops that really discourages local solutions from getting the money. They prefer to lend to big, stable organizations like Frontier and Windstream, companies that are going through bankruptcy right now. And it makes you think, we know that AT&T does not care about rural America. We know that CenturyLink has been very clear for years that they will only invest in rural America where they get most of the money from someone else. And for some reason, that seems to still be the way the federal government thinks it should be distributing money. And it should have figured out a long time ago that's not the best model. But it's it just seems like it's set by who has the powerful lobby rather than what's best for a community like you. I mean, you, like most communities, don't get a say in how the money is spent on your benefit. And it's just wrong.
Well, and indeed, we have formed and registered a cooperative here with the intent of raising money to build a rural fiber broadband network, but unfortunately haven't been able to participate in any of the universal service schemes because of that requirement of being a commercial operator. I understand this is government money, and one wants to make sure that it is spent in a responsible way. At the same time, cooperatives have demonstrated themselves throughout the U.S., in northern England, in Spain, as being very, very credible alternatives, and creating mechanisms to allow them to thrive. I think, it's just a missed opportunity. The irony is that, cooperatives have such a pedigree where I live in Nova Scotia. They've been around for 150 years, and in the agricultural sector, in the finance sector, have proven to be like the optimum mechanism in many ways for stimulating, rural economies.
Yes, it is frankly depressing how few lessons were taken correctly from the enormous success of the Rural Electrification Administration. To some extent, I'm glad people do still recollect that it happened, and that's how we connected rural America. But people really haven't yet understood that the magic was the local ownership of the cooperatives rather than a whole lot of federal money.
Well, and indeed, I mean, that lesson is being taken on in not just in the global north, but in the global south, in South Africa, in the Eastern Cape. There's a cooperative that was formed just a few years ago called Zenzeleni, and they are delivering internet services in a rural area at a fraction of the cost of the incumbents. And they could be doing so much better. Not to circle the conversation around, but if they had access to spectrum, because they have Wi-Fi technologies, which are great, but not great for rural areas where you're trying to cover a large, sparsely populated region. So that's certainly part of my work now is working to encourage regulators to release that spectrum in rural areas. One of the things we know is that spectrum in rural areas in any country you pick in the world is mostly unoccupied. If you take something like 2.6 gigahertz, which is a popular LTE band in the UK, into rural areas, it's maybe 5% occupation of that spectrum. So what is needed, I think, are, specific rules around rural access to spectrum. We can't treat it the same as in urban areas. And that's where one place where the UK is actually pioneering very interesting and new models for access to LTE spectrum specifically designed for rural areas. So that, I mean, and it's interesting. It's it's a bit like CBRS, but it's more targeted to areas where there is no use of spectrum in rural areas, whereas CBRS is more generic in that respect.
Well, that's excellent. It's a good note of hope to end on. And I appreciate you taking the time to come on the show, Steve, and share this, the work you've done around the world, but also helping us to remind ourselves that just because we did things one way in the past doesn't mean we have to keep doing them the wrong way.
Well, I'm flattered to be asked. I'm a big fan of your work.
That was Christopher talking with Steve Song of Mozilla. We have transcripts for this and other podcasts available at muninetworks.org/broadbandbits. Email us at podcast@muninetworks.org with your ideas for the show. Follow Chris on Twitter. His handle is @CommunityNets. Follow muninetworks.org stories on Twitter. The handle is @muninetworks. Subscribe to this and the other podcasts from ILSR, Building Local Power, Local Energy Rules, and the Composting for Community podcast. You can access them anywhere you get your podcasts. You can catch the latest important research from all of our initiatives if you subscribe to our monthly newsletter at ilsr.org. While you're there, please take a moment to donate. Your support in any amount keeps us going. Thank you to Arna Huseby for the song Warm Duck Shuffle, licensed through Creative Commons. This was episode 403 of the Community Broadband Bits podcast. Thanks for listening.